I have already expressed some skepticism about this business of climate event attribution. Now they also have weather event attribution to climate change, in the sense that you have extreme events happening: heat waves, wildfires, floods, droughts, etc. And you know that global warming can do that, but then you are going to go and take specific events or frequency of events like heat waves and say, at a particular place, climate change made the event more probable by X percent or more intense by X percent duration, etc. And then you are going to try and find whose emissions may be responsible for that. So there was just the idea of attribution where you said specific extreme events or types of extreme events were made worse by climate change. Now we are going further and saying we can actually track emissions of Exxon Mobil or Chevron and Shell and so on, and say they have emitted so much CO2 over time, and that is responsible for a particular weather event, even not just class of events. So how does it work? That's the first question, whether this approach even makes sense. Because when we say ExxonMobil has emitted so much carbon over time, ExxonMobil is producing oil, it's not burning it. We are burning it, everybody is using it. Then you can say, but ExxonMobil knew about the impacts of burning fossil fuels and they didn't warn us. This happened for tobacco companies, for example, in the 80s and 90s. There were a lot of litigations saying tobacco companies knew about the harm caused by tobacco consumption, but they didn't warn people enough. So they were penalized, and now they're responsible for warning people, those gory pictures on cigarette packs and so on. So this business of carbon majors and the scientific case for climate liability is evolving, and scientific approaches from the climate side have shown that they can actually track emissions from particular carbon majors, companies that produce these fossil fuels, and attribute the certain level of warming. Like Chevron is responsible for 0.025 degrees C warming out of the 1 degree C total. ExxonMobil is responsible for 0.036 degrees centigrade warming out of the 1 degree total, and so on. So look at some details, and I will add my own skeptical comments again. It's a nice long paper to just understand the logic behind this approach. And as the authors say, they are excited by two advances. One is this attribution science from the climate side, and the other is the social science advances where warming and other climate events can be linked to specific socioeconomic outcomes, mostly losses in GDP and other things, lives, livelihoods, etc. Right? So let's read the abstract and then add a few more words from the figures. I won't read a lot of the text, but will it ever be possible to sue anyone for damaging the climate? 20 years after this question was first posed, we argue that the scientific case for climate liability is closed. That means it's all acceptable now. Wow. It has a long way to go in terms of actual lawyers getting through this. Here we detail the scientific and legal implications of an end-to-end attribution that links fossil fuel producers to specific damages from warming, using Scope 1 and Scope 3 emissions data from the major fossil fuel companies, peer-reviewed attribution methods, and advances in empirical climate economics. We illustrate the trillions in economic losses attributable to the extreme heat caused by emissions from individual companies. So the entire framework itself relies on making the companies that produce fossil fuels responsible for the emissions and not the consumers. So already there is some problem there in my mind. But nonetheless, peer-reviewed is used as a way to say that's a legitimate and acceptable approach. Uncertainties are always an issue, especially when you talk about empirical climate economics. There are damage functions and so on, which are just knobs that you can produce very different numbers by tweaking them. Okay, so emissions linked to Chevron, the highest emitting investor owned company in our data, for example, very likely caused between US $791 billion and $3.6 trillion in heat related losses over the period of 1991 to 2020, disproportionately harming the tropical regions least culpable for warming in terms of historic emissions. So, when you have such a large range of numbers, 791 billion to 3.6 trillion, so three times the range is over three times. So you have to make causal links in a legal case. There is something called but for. In other words, but for Chevron's emissions, these losses would not have happened. That has to be shown in a causative links. More broadly, we outline uh, a transparent, reproducible, and flexible framework that formalizes how end-to-end attribution could inform litigation by assessing whose emissions are responsible for which harms. I hope you understand. Overall, there are emissions that can be measured, they are growing and they are causing warming. Uh, and now we are saying there are multiple contributors to the warming. Carbon majors are the ones which are being considered here, like the fossil fuel company, oil companies. And we are saying their specific emissions can be tracked to classes of events here, 1991 to 2020 heat related losses. Okay. Um, Drawing quantitative linkages between individual emitters and particularized harms is now feasible, making science no longer an obstacle to the justiciability of climate liability claims. Justiciability. I didn't hear the word before. Only after reading this paper, I looked it up. Justiciability. Okay, so essentially, it's about where we started in the beginning. Climate scientists themselves said individual weather events cannot be attributed to climate change. Then we said, well, attribution is possible. Now we are going deeper and saying uh, emissions from carbon majors can be tracked to uh, events, extreme events, and the damages caused by them. So that's the end-to-end system they are talking about. Essentially, you can have liability cases coming from classes of heat waves. If you say in your country heat waves or droughts or floods or hurricanes, wildfires have increased over a certain period, then if you can connect them to emissions and emissions by Chevron or Exxon, then you can say they are liable. It has to hold up in the court. More and more climate litigations are coming along. Netherlands was a case where I think youth sued the government for not doing enough, and the courts held up the liability of the government and so on. So where this is going is not always clear, but science keeps pushing this framework in the meantime. As courts rely on scientific synthesis from organizations such as the IPCC, the consensus developed around event attribution methods suggests that they could meet legal standards for admissibility by revealing the human fingerprint on events previously thought to be acts of God. Attribution science has helped make climate change legally legible. You can extract uh, climate change related damages and then attribute them to the emitters. Okay. Legally, focus has been on assessing whether climate attribution is compatible with existing causation and standing frameworks. You have to go into the legal aspects of it to say whether the cases center on the disinformation and climate denialism allegedly fomented by carbon fuel companies, whereas others contend that companies have failed to adequately disclose climate risks to investors. So there are people who are affected, and then there are people who are losing investments, or investors who feel liable for the damage done by the companies. Other climate related cases fall outside these categories, and new legal theories will continue to emerge. So we are going to fit new legal frameworks to track legibility of climate change legalities. Okay, so here basically they are picking so I hope you got the point that if climate fossil fuel companies are lying about the potential damage by the emissions, then people can be argued to be innocent of using fossil fuels, like saying, I didn't know smoking would cause cancer because the tobacco producers who sold me the tobacco didn't tell me. Okay, and of course, the other is to say, at what point did we begin to ignore the fact that global warming is happening because of emissions, and emissions are coming from fossil fuels that we are burning, and so on, right? So there are many details that I will skip, because the main point of this paper is that scientific framework is now robust for going from climate change to extreme events, and then to the emitters who contributed to that uh, climate change, global warming. So, fate of climate liability cases remains uncertain, though success, failures, and appeals abound, and this is across the globe in many cases. So, there is a talk of a wave of a coming wave of climate legal action for which courts are woefully unprepared, and scientists want to play a role in it with this end-to-end system that this paper is arguing for. But just jumping ahead to some of the details on how this has to be done, uh, you are obviously relying on climate models to do the attribution, which means you take a climate model and you give it anthropogenic emissions, and it produces observed global warming, details about deficiencies in patterns and local warming, and converting warming into extreme rainfall, and so on and so forth. But there are chronic changes in warming, and there are chronic changes in sea level rise, glacier losses, and then there are acute stressors like heat waves and extreme rainfall duration, intensity, frequency, scale of these events, etc. So economic damage comes from both. Background warming affects agriculture, labor productivity, and health issues, and overall economic losses, and then acute stresses, of course, add. And then the paper has details that when you do economic damage calculations, you assume that the extreme events have damage using these empirical climate economic models, but the damage then goes away in a few years, and economies recover from that shock of extreme events, and so on. But coming back to using the models do simulations with given known emissions, and to attribute any particular event or class of events to emissions, you have to find a world where emissions didn't happen. We call that the counterfactual world. So you take the same model and you withhold the emissions and say where the temperature would have been, where the heat waves would have been, and then you compare the real world with emissions to the counterfactual world, and then you can extend this framework to say, if we only withheld Chevron's emissions or Exxon's emissions, what is the contribution of their emissions to warming? Remembering again that emissions of Chevron are not Chevron burning fossil fuel, but producing fossil fuels and selling the fossil fuels to us who use it, because we are innocent about the impacts of fossil fuel burning. Okay, so all these are very tricky, and the main thing to remember also is the big, complicated, full scope IPCC models cannot be run for these attribution exercises, because you have to make lots of simulations, and it takes a lot of time. So we produce something called reduced complexity climate models that accurately simulate the behavior of Earth system using a smaller number of equations. So remember, the full models are deficient, they are not perfect. Simplified models are similar to the full models in many ways for, let's say, global warming and heat wave statistics at some location, and so on. But deficiencies may be worse in the reduced complexity climate models. So we have to kind of assume that the courts will accept these results, or you have to see whether lawyers will be able to tear through these RCMs and various assumptions to say, we just don't buy this attribution at all. Okay, so in the end-to-end framework, basically the coal, oil, and gas extracted by fossil fuel companies uh, have produced substantial emissions of carbon dioxide and methane. Between 1920 and 2020, Saudi Aramco, Chevron, and ExxonMobil produced cumulative total of 16.6, 14.2, and 13.2 gigaton carbon in CO2 emissions, respectively. Essentially, CO2 is well mixed, long lasting gas. So, if you keep emitting, it'll keep accumulating because its residence time is many, many centuries, right? So, this is how you would think about the data. Include both scope 1 and scope 3. Scope 1 is, of course, 1 and 2 are what come up to the production, and scope 3 is after your product is out of the production site, it's being transported to the user. So those are scope 3. And there's always a debate about whether the companies that produce something are responsible for scope 3, or they're only responsible for scope 1 and 2. So it's always important to mention these things. Okay, so the paper only illustrate emissions since 1920. We'll see figures where analysis uses all available company level data. So they are basically relying on company data. So let's look at the few figures. I'm being very brief with the text because I just want to give you the idea. And obviously, I'm coming from a skeptical viewpoint because I just think we are all in this together. We're all responsible. Oil companies obviously lied for a long time about the impacts of fossil fuel and CO2 on climate, but people were not exactly innocent. We all kind of keep burning fossil fuels, or lifestyles are energy intensive, even though we know that that's not a good thing in terms of our energy intensive lifestyles, knowing that energy is mostly coming from fossil fuels, right? So emissions by carbon majors: Saudi Aramco, Chevron, ExxonMobil, BP. There are some ups and downs. You can see the financial crises and other things appear in oil markets to perturb these things. So when these attribution exercises are done here, they're only looking at emissions and not the impacts of markets and demands, ups and downs, financial perturbations, and so on. So these assumptions also matter. And the way they define extremes is to look at the warmest 5 days in every year in terms of the change caused by each measure. So you can see here the mean and virtually certain. So they have to give it sorry, I shouldn't be doing but they will be the model looks for change in the probability of those maximum 5 days and how certain we are. So this is the range around the mean: virtually certain at 99%, very likely at 90%, and likely at 66%. So you can see in terms of global mean, maximum 5 day change in degrees centigrade, contributions from BP, Gazprom, Saudi Aramco, ExxonMobil, and Chevron. So Chevron has the largest contribution in terms of the changes because that's the largest emitters or largest oil producers. Global mean temperature change, on the other hand, the contributions again coming from the carbon measures. And here are the economic effects of extreme heat with the mean in the solid red line and 90% confidence interval around it. Marginal effects of warmest 5 days in pp per year. So I think it's purchasing parity. I forgot. I read the paper almost a month ago, but nonetheless, you can check it out. Yeah, sorry, percentage points per degree Celsius. Completely wrong. Percentage points per degree centigrade is the marginal effect. Marginal effect, I understand what it means. You have economic activities and effects of various hazards, etc., happening, and you are looking for the marginal effect of the change in the 5 warmest days in a year caused by these carbon majors. Okay, I'm being very brief, but you get the point. So the basic science question and credibility question and legal question you have to ask is, with all the simplifications and the empirical relations going from here to here, and the idea that each companies' emissions can be tracked to levels of warming and levels of extremes, does this end-to-end system hold up scientifically and legally? Okay, so that's the question I would want to leave you with. This is the estimated cumulative economic losses from extreme heat by carbon majors, again, without going into too many details. Losses from individual companies and losses from groups, and this is in trillions of dollars. Sorry, global heat-driven losses in US dollars in trillions. So again, virtually certain. The scales go from virtually certain to very likely, and we have different companies here. Saudi Aramco, highest at 2.05 trillion. So you can already see that the contributions to five maximum warmest days in a year, Saudi Aramco is third here, but in the losses, it's the top one. So obviously, there are some translations from contributions to emissions to five warmest days to economic losses. Okay, obviously, it depends on where the oil was sold, where it was used, etc. You understand? Gazprom, Chevron, ExxonMobil, and BP. BP is the lowest in both cases. Losses from top five companies to various countries, GDP per capita change over 1991 to 2020. You can see mostly negative numbers, which means nobody has benefited from the emissions from gas companies, oil companies, top five companies. And you can see even the oil producers in the Middle East here, Saudi Arabia, and of course there are oil producers everywhere. Russia is one, US produces, South America, Venezuela has some, and so on. So these are losses from groups of companies, all, and IOCs, these are investor-owned companies, state-owned enterprises, and top five. So here again a detail. If I'm an oil fossil fuel consumer and I'm really worried about oil companies doing this to me, and I have a retirement account which is investing somewhere I don't know, what if my retirement account has investments in oil companies? Then it's hard to extricate myself from the responsibility of what is happening, right? So that would be my main point here. Estimated losses from individual extreme heat events by carbon majors. This is where it gets really tricky, where you are taking in, specific events like India 98, France 2003, Russia 2010, and United States 2012, and you are doing these simulations of again average change in regional maximum warmest 5 days of the year, and you are looking at again contributions from various sectors or various classes. What did we call them? Losses from groups, right? So all, and investor owned, state owned, and top five, and losses in US dollars in billions pegged to 2020. And you can see again how it accumulates all five together. Investor owned is larger than state owned, and so on in France. And these are separating the top five again separately. BP comes as the lowest, Russia and United States. What do you do this? Can you go to court with this? This is the main question, and the argument by the authors of the paper is that yes, this is now scientifically robust and legally legible, so that you can go to court with this. Okay, so clarifying who is responsible, just to read a few more words. How could end-to-end attribution analysis such as ours be used? Each case will differ and depend on the motivation of the litigants and their climate context. What they are asking for. Are they asking for community level compensation for increased heat waves and losses on agriculture, let's say, or lack of water or health issues and so on? Or is there an individual who's saying, I got hammered by this heat wave and all my crops were lost. Somebody has to pay me, right? So as presented in figures 2 and 3, science can clarify but for causation, which means but for Chevron's emissions, this would never have happened kind of argument. But for causation at various scales across a class of hazards such as heat waves, or for a particular event such as the 1998 Indian heat wave. But it's also essential to clarify who is potentially liable. There are many emitters, and affected communities may want to know who is most liable for impacts they endure? Whom do they name as defendant? A nation, a company, a collective, a sector? These two science can help clarify. So far, attorneys and litigants have often named defendants as part of the initial legal process under the assumption that knowing a defendant's emissions is sufficient to make a claim. Our analysis makes clear, however, that what matters is not simply the magnitude of the emissions, but also the time scale over which they were released and the impact under consideration. So, such details matter in court, and obviously, lawyers are going to argue in many different ways. But calculating the contributions of all possible emitters could be costly, just in terms of separating them and then arguing that they are scientifically robust, legally legible, and so on. Legal work is expensive and time consuming, and the need to retain experts could be a crucial barrier to the low income and under resourced communities who have the greatest claims for restitution in terms of vulnerabilities to climate impacts created by the rich countries. Okay, I will just read a bit about the remaining work. By clarifying what damages and who is responsible, our attribution frameworks have flexibility and applicability to many contexts. Extreme heat is one of myriad climate impacts, and the costs we assess are large. So, in this paper, they only consider heat because that has the most direct impact on economic activities in terms of empirical relations we can generate. But multi hazard extremes, droughts and heat waves together, or floods and health together, and heat waves and water issues, energy issues, and so on, may produce better results in terms of overall economic impacts. But most of the lawsuits have also come in terms of heat waves and so on. So they think they can add further extreme rainfall and El Ninos and so on to these. So if El Nino is a natural mode of climate variability, but there is a background warming, then can El Nino impacts be made worse by climate change, and hence climate change liability goes back to fossil fuel or carbon majors and so on. Given the flexible open source nature of RCMs, the reduced complexity models, and the maintenance of pre-existing pattern scaling libraries, such damage estimates can be easily ported into our framework to provide a more complete documentation of the costs attributable to particular emitters. Okay, so the framework we advance here is flexible and its potential applications are broad. Okay, so let's look at one more figure and then I'll jump to the end. So this is attributable damages depend on emissions and the time period considered. So here you are talking about contributions from 1850 to 2020 in percentages. Again, confidence levels are shown. These are global losses in trillions of US dollars back to 2020. So top five are here and all together are here in terms of the contribution of the cumulative emissions. And the start date effect, depending on where you start, 1850, 1977, oh, I have some allergy, or 1990, you can see that the damage from 5% contributions in US dollars is very different. And these are not small numbers, they're trillions of dollars, right? So attributable damages depend on emissions and the time period considered. Attributable global heat driven economic losses over 1991 to 2020 in 2020 US dollars as a function of the percent contribution to global CO2 and methane emissions over the 1850 to 2020 period. Losses attributable to a 5% contribution. So basically what I said. So again, the question is, where is the science and how uncertain is the science and how uncertain are the empirical translations to economic losses? And then can you really hold oil companies liable based on the argument that they didn't divulge the risks associated with fossil fuel I'm buying and putting in my car and driving around? As climate disasters accumulate, courts will see more and more climate cases. Formalizing communication and education between the scientific and judicial communities is vital, ensuring that science is useful and that courts recognize its limits. Alongside these efforts, new legal theories and the urgent press of climate disaster could spur courts to embrace climate liability claims. The next 20 years will bring greater clarity on these remaining questions, Here we provide an essential start: the development of a rigorous, flexible, and transparent and widely acceptable end-to-end attribution framework. Well, this is an academic paper, so it has to go through its phases in terms of actual legal applications. So, as brief as I was, this is still 30 minutes long, but I've tried to keep it simple enough so that hopefully it's useful. Okay, see you in the next topic.